Have you ever been in a debate where you are just so certain you're right, only to think back on it later and go, maybe I missed something? Yeah, we've all been there. It turns out our brains have these little shortcuts, these mental tripwires, that can lead us down the wrong path, even when we're trying our absolute best to be logical. Today, we're going to dive deep into this world of cognitive bias and see how it can pop up in even the most serious intellectual arguments.
And that brings us to a really fascinating and honestly a kind of unsettling question. Can someone who is truly rational still be biased? Well, the answer seems to be a big, fat yes. It looks like no matter how much we value logic and evidence, our minds are just wired with these invisible biases that can subtly, quietly steer our thinking. So to really see how this works in the wild, we're going to look at a specific case study. We're going to explore a source that puts the arguments of the very well-known atheist thinker Alex O'Connor, who you might know as the cosmic skeptic, right under the microscope. The goal is to see how these biases can supposedly show up in these high-stakes, real-world debates. All right, let's get into it. The main idea from our source is that pretty much everyone, and I mean everyone, whether you're an atheist, a theist, or anything else, has these biases that can shape our conclusions. It's not a bug, it's a feature of being human. So where does this source claim these biases first appear? Well, it points to a really big one right out of the gate, confirmation bias. You've probably heard of this one before. It's that classic human tendency to just see what we already believe is true. So what is confirmation bias, really? Think of your brain as a lawyer who already knows which side they're on. It goes out and actively looks for any piece of evidence that supports its case, while conveniently ignoring, downplaying, or explaining away anything that contradicts it. It's like wearing glasses that only let you see things that prove you're right. So how does our source see this playing out? Well, the text argues that in Critiques of Christianity, O'Connor often zooms in on historical failures, things like the Crusades or the Inquisition, to build a story that Christianity is, at its core, a negative force. And this right here, this slide really gets to the core of the source's claim. You see, on one side, there's a focus on tough issues, like the problem of evil. But on the other side, the analysis claims that the complex theological answers, like the free will defense and Christianity's positive contributions to things like science and human rights, often get left out. The source argues this creates a really skewed and ultimately an incomplete picture. But here's the thing. Confirmation bias rarely works alone. The source suggests it often partners up with another powerful bias, the availability bias. This one is all about what's loudest and most memorable in our heads. So the availability bias is our brain's tendency to judge how common something is based on how easily we can think of an example. Like if you see a bunch of news stories about shark attacks, you might start to think they're way more common than they actually are. Those vivid, emotional stories just stick in our minds and skew our perception of reality. A perfect example of this, which the source brings up, is the whole Galileo affair. It's probably the most famous story of conflict between the church and a scientist. And because it's so available in our minds, the source claims it gets used as a kind of shorthand to argue that Christianity itself is fundamentally anti-science. Now, what's so interesting here is how the source frames this. It suggests that by focusing on these really sensational, almost headline-grabbing examples, like a hypocritical leader or the Galileo story, the broader, quieter, and maybe more nuanced context gets totally lost. This includes, the source says, the integrity of millions of believers and the long history of Christian-supported science. Okay, the third and final bias the source gets into is a really tricky one, overconfidence. This is what you might call the certainty trap, where feeling absolutely 100% right can actually prevent a productive conversation from even starting. Overconfidence bias is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. We just overestimate how right we are. It gives us this false sense of certainty in our own arguments, and because of that, it can make us really dismissive of other viewpoints. Not because they're bad arguments, but because we're just so sure of our own that we don't even give them a fair shot. So how does this actually show up in an argument? The source suggests that a complex concept like faith can get flattened into a simple caricature, like defining it as just belief without any evidence. But the analysis claims this is a major mischaracterization that ignores centuries of really deep Christian thought on how faith and reason work together. So the key takeaway on this slide is that contrast. On one side, you have this portrayal of theism as being just plain irrational. But on the other side, the source points to these incredibly robust philosophical defenses from thinkers like Alvin Plantinga and William Lane Craig and this whole idea of faith as a kind of reasoned trust, which are said to be just dismissed without real engagement.
So when you put it all together, the source presents this thesis. These three biases, confirmation, availability, and overconfidence, can all work together to build a flawed argument. They can lead to using narrow, cherry-picked evidence, creating a distorted picture by blowing up the negatives, and, in the end, just shutting down the kind of real dialogue that leads to growth and understanding. Okay, so if our minds are just naturally prone to all these biases, what are we supposed to do about it? Well, the source doesn't just point out the problem, it also offers up a potential path forward. It proposes this alternative framework, one that's actually grounded in Christian thought, for how we can all approach these big conversations with a bit more intellectual humility.
And the whole spirit of that framework is really captured in this verse that the source quotes from the book of James. Be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. It's basically a call for an intellectual posture that's centered on listening first rather than just leading with our own assertions. The source really boils this down into three core principles. First, humility, just acknowledging that none of us have a perfect, godlike view of reality. Second, openness, having a genuine willingness to seek truth, even if it leads you to uncomfortable places. And third, a balanced perspective, one that doesn't create a false war between things like faith and reason.
So, in the end, whether you're a theist, an atheist, or you're somewhere else entirely, the challenge this analysis presents is really for all of us. The next time you find yourself digging in your heels in a debate, maybe just take a second to pause. Ask yourself, am I genuinely trying to find the truth here? Or am I just looking for ammo to prove what I already think? It's a tough question, for sure, but it's so important. Because ultimately, the goal shouldn't be just to win, but to get a little bit closer to what's true. So, what are your intellectual blind spots?